What would you do if Bitcoin hit $1 million? Maybe you'd have more money in your bank account. Maybe you'd go buy some ape NFTs. But let's expand the conversation outside of your pocket for a second. If Bitcoin got that big, it would have vast implications for the whole world. And that's why you need to listen to this episode. I talked to my buddy Logan, a 33-year-old lawyer who's also the author behind the popular newsletter called Think Bitcoin. We talk about why Bitcoin might hit $1 million, but more important than that, Logan offers some incredibly practical insight on the importance of Bitcoin in our economy and on the world stage. And we talk about what it is about Bitcoin that makes it so exciting to follow. As always, before we dive into the show, it would mean the world to me if you would subscribe to my channel. I'll give you a second to do it. Go click that button. Oh, thank you. Now enjoy the show. Logan, what's going on? Welcome to Fireside Chats, man.
Thanks, Ian. How are you? Glad to be here.
I'm great. We go back and forth in the DMs talking about cryptocurrency, and I subscribe to your newsletter, which I have to say is kind of unlike anything else that I read out there. So I just want to off the bat plug it because anybody that's listening to this should go subscribe. Can you just tell us where we can do that?
Sure. And thank you for the endorsements. It's at thinkbitcoin.substack.com. Yeah, it's a weekly newsletter about Bitcoin. It's completely and totally free. Comes out every Sunday. I try to make it, it's aimed towards people who are interested in Bitcoin, but aren't, totally immersed in the space and looking for a good place to start.
I love it because the perspective that you lend is really in depth and it's supported by data and real life information. And I think if anybody wants to get their feet wet in more of the like I said, more of the data and less of the hype, you got to go read this. I want to talk about the price of Bitcoin. You made an interesting case in an article that you posted, a blog post of yours that I read a couple months ago about how Bitcoin can solve the country's debt crisis and economic crisis. And I'm going to link to that post in the comments too for everybody to read. But because this is a short web series, let's keep it succinct. Talk to me about the price of Bitcoin. Do you ever see this thing hitting $1 million?
Short answer, exciting answer. Yes, I would say I do, but I want to be really careful about kind of putting a timeline on that. What I want to be clear about is I certainly don't expect one Bitcoin to be worth $1 million next year or the year after that. But do I think within the next decade, the next 15 years, one Bitcoin could be worth 1 million United States dollars? I certainly do. And just put some numbers around that. If you think the market cap of gold right now is about 10 trillion, and the market cap of Bitcoin is about 1 trillion. If Bitcoin were to get to gold's market cap, if it were to simply capture the market cap that gold has, which is a relatively small amount of sort of global asset allocation, it would be $500,000 per Bitcoin. And again, that's merely capturing gold's market cap. So most people think Bitcoin is obviously already taking some market share from gold in the kind of store of value asset space. But if you think of global bonds, I mean, there are about $120 trillion, I think, of global bonds, that many of which are negative real yielding because of inflation. The real yields on those bonds are actually negative. So I think it's pretty reasonable to think that at some point, asset managers are going to look at their bond allocations, which are actually yielding negatively because of inflation, and say, hey, we have mandates to get a certain amount of yield here in this portfolio. And so we need to look elsewhere. And I think they're going to be, if some of those managers allocate 1%, 2% to Bitcoin, then I think we're getting Bitcoin's market cap closer to 20 trillion, which would be $1 million per Bitcoin.
Wow.
So I think there's a pathway there. I think it's going to take some time though. So I don't think we should be expecting it in the next year or two. It would be wonderful if the timeline was quicker, obviously, but
what do you see happening in 2022?
I think 2022 is going to be a really interesting year in asset markets generally, because I think we have a really interesting combination of factors at play. For the last 18 months, we've had the combination of historically loose monetary policy, the Fed being very dovish, historically so, and combined with that, we've also had a lot of fiscal stimulus. So we've had, the fiscal, historically robust fiscal interventions, along with this historically loose monetary policy. And so the stock market's been going crazy. I mean, it's been going parabolic for the last 18 months, we all know. And now all of a sudden, we got inflation starting to run hot, CPI inflation at least, and we got the Fed at least paying lip service to the idea that they're going to stop being so dovish. And we don't have a Build Back Better bill yet. There's no imminent fiscal infusions coming right now. I think eventually we'll get some more of that. So we're kind of looking at this major, if you think of the markets as kind of, we've been drunk sort of for 18 months. And now it seems like the punch bowl might be starting to kind of get taken away a little bit. So what does that mean for Bitcoin specifically? I think there's potentially a risk because of those factors I just mentioned of kind of an economic slowdown and maybe sort of the middle part of the year. Once those things start to kind of kick in, I think that could maybe lend itself to a little bit of a risk-off sentiment in the market, which usually means people are looking at their perceived riskiest positions and kind of taking some risk off the table. So, I think it's going to be the first half of the year for Bitcoin is going to be interesting to see how those macroeconomic factors affect the price. But that being said, I think if the Fed proceeds to tighten and does so too aggressively into slowing growth, that typically leads to a recession, which I think would cause the Fed to just stop their tightening and sort of reinstitute quantitative easing, which I think is long-term bullish for Bitcoin. That would just kind of recreate the circumstances that we've had in the last 18 months that have been great for all asset markets, really. Bitcoin certainly in particular.
Your experience, I think in all of your, most of your content that I've read, you focus on Bitcoin. Do you pay attention to the other other blockchain networks and their respective coins?
I do, but significantly less so, Ian. And the reason, part of the reason being is this is such a new space and there's just so much to know and learn, as I'm sure, that you experience, it's like every week there's some new use case for some new crypto coin or protocol. So it's really, for my own sanity, really, I focus, but I think there's some really important distinctions between Bitcoin and every other cryptocurrency. Just to touch on quickly, Bitcoin's, I think this is important for people to understand. Bitcoin's genesis is unlike any other of the cryptocurrencies. I mean, there were no what would be referred to as sort of pre-mined coins. There was no VC investors received any Bitcoin before the general public. Nobody received any Bitcoin before they were mined. Every single Bitcoin in existence has been mined. It's the most decentralized protocol without question. It's the only crypto that the SEC, even Chair Gary Gensler has himself acknowledged on multiple occasions. This is not a security. Every other cryptocurrency is arguably, and many I would say are undoubtedly and incontrovertibly securities. I mean, I think certainly per the SEC chair. So I think there's some really important differences. I mean, there are no leaders in Bitcoin. There's no sort of governance committee at the top. There's no Vitalik Buterin running Bitcoin. So I think there's certainly a distinction between Bitcoin and everything else. And so that's why I choose to focus on Bitcoin, because I think it's the most compelling case for a new reserve asset in the world.
One of the things I think about a lot in terms of Bitcoin's role as a reserve asset is its utility. Gold, for example, has use in electronics and we wear it as jewelry and it's a precious metal. what do you see happening in terms of the utility of Bitcoin? Do you think the next year, next 5 years, we start to see it getting used? And I compare that to Ethereum. I think that the use of Ethereum is built on this premise of smart contracts, right? So we're seeing a
Mhm.
lot of it used now with NFTs, and we don't have to get into NFTs, but I think that's where you really see the utility of Ethereum.
Bitcoin's utility, I think, is different kind of depending on where you are and under what circumstances you live and under what circumstances you transact. For example, if you are living in one of the many countries that has an authoritarian regime or double-digit inflation, if you're somewhere like Afghanistan or you're in Nigeria, Ethiopia, Cuba, Venezuela, places like that. I mean, these are places where there's a lot of Bitcoin adoption and Bitcoin being used for daily transactions, which we, of course, in the West, under a relatively stable currency, comparatively stable currency like the dollar, you and I are probably not going out and buying things with Bitcoin because we see how much its value is appreciating and we're just kind of hodling it, we're holding it. And that's situational. Like for us, we don't need it to be a medium of exchange for us. But there are plenty of other places where that is currently the use case for Bitcoin because it's also censorship resistant. So for example, if you're a woman in Afghanistan, you can hold your wealth, you can be paid in Bitcoin, you can hold it, nobody has to know you have it, you can transact with it. If you're a refugee, you can literally walk across borders with just your seed phrase to your hardware wallet in your head. So you actually get to preserve your assets in the scenario where you're fleeing a country. And for folks more interested in those use cases in those types of countries, I would direct you to the work of Alex Gladstein, who is he works at a human rights nonprofit. He's also a journalist and a human rights activist. He writes a lot about this stuff, and he's written about this in all the countries I just mentioned. I see that being continuing to evolve. I think the Lightning Network, which is a layer 2 solution to sort of Bitcoin scalability that allows people to transact really quickly and easily with almost no fees, that's continuing to grow in use. I see that trend continuing. And you mentioned smart contracts, and I would just point out that Taproot is an upgrade to the Bitcoin protocol that just happened this year. That's sort of opens the door for smart contracts on Bitcoin. And lastly, I would say I expect Bitcoin to start to be used more as collateral in larger transactions. It's kind of pristine collateral in a lot of ways. So I think it was Goldman Sachs who has announced that they're looking at ways to issue loans based on Bitcoin as collateral. I think eventually, I don't know if this is next year, but I think eventually you'll be able to use Bitcoin as collateral for, say, a house, something like that.
Yeah. You can do that right now, obviously, with cash. You can get a letter of credit or you just put money down, right? You can do that with a stock portfolio. You can get a loan on that. That's super interesting. I'd be very curious to know how they're going to underwrite based on how much Bitcoin you're holding. But if you think about a lot of people have been newly created millionaires as a result of holding Bitcoin. It's a market to lend on those holdings. So that's pretty cool. It sounds like there's a lot that's going to happen. There's a lot to happen with Bitcoin over the next year, over the next couple of years. What do you say to people who are wondering, hey, Bitcoin's run up. Do I get in now or do I just kind of wait? Without giving investment advice, by the way.
Right, of course. Yeah, obviously caveating, as you said, it's not investment advice, but I would just urge people to focus less on the price and more on the use case that Bitcoin serves. I think the more you understand and the more you learn about the macroeconomic situation, the global economy, the corners that we have kind of painted ourselves into, and the ways in which Bitcoin fits in and seeks to solve and improve some of those issues, the less the price matters, because at the end of the day, we're also measuring the price in dollar terms, which is a currency that is also being debased regularly and at an accelerating rate. So people in the Bitcoin community like to say that ultimately one Bitcoin equals one Bitcoin. And at the end of the day, one Bitcoin equals one Bitcoin. We can measure it in against all these other currencies that are being debased by the various central banks. But yeah, I would say the folks that I know that are really hyper concerned about price, and especially the short-term price movements, it's usually because they, sort of rushed in, they were excited. There's a lot of hype that anytime the price runs up, there's a lot of hype. People kind of come in without fully understanding just how interdisciplinary this thing is, just how many, Bitcoin takes into account or kind of forces you to learn about law and policy and economic history and monetary policy and geopolitics, cryptography, computer science. It's such an interdisciplinary thing that I would just urge people to, you don't have to put the house for sale and go all in on Bitcoin tomorrow,
Right.
just take your time. There's a lot to learn. I'm still learning. I've been doing this for a little while, and it's an intellectually exhilarating journey that I'm still very much on myself.
That to me is what makes this whole thing fascinating, because there is that much information out there.
Totally.
There's so much debate. There are people that dedicate their spare time, like you, to a newsletter. There's regulation that's going to come out. There's, like you said, political implications. There's so much in this world. And that's what I think lends so much credence to the fact that this is here to stay and people should be giving it more attention.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And Ian, one of the things I'm going to write about in my newsletter this week is kind of how I think that it's difficult for a lot of people to conceptualize Bitcoin and really kind of confront it in a productive way, because we're so used to, in this space that you and I kind of operate in, this personal finance space, we're so used to viewing everything through this very investment vehicle specific lens. We ask questions like, is it a quote unquote productive asset? Is there cash flow? Is it quote unquote backed by something? What are its historical returns? What can we project into the future? And which is all great. I think those are great heuristics, and I think have been really helpful for all of us in our financial lives utilizing those. But what I think we kind of miss is that I think Bitcoin has a sort of historic sweep to it. I view Bitcoin personally as more of akin to something like the invention of the printing press, for example, than I do of comparing it to some other investment vehicle like the S&P 500 or something like that. So I think shifting our lens to a more historical paradigm shifting, something that will be written about in the history books 200 years from now, that kind of reshaped, remolded, reorganized society and the way in which we live and relate to each other and transact as economically. And I think shifting that lens a little bit, I think, is useful as well. So I'm going to write about it this week, and I hope folks find it useful. But I think that's a good thing to think about if you're kind of new to the space.
Love it. Let's end on that. I can't top that. We mentioned a lot of resources, everything. I'll link to all that in the show notes so people can read it. We are just scratching the surface. But again, if you're watching this, I would definitely subscribe to Logan's newsletter and get out there and do the work. Will Bitcoin ever be worth $1 million? Maybe. But I think there's more to it that we've discussed here today.
Will it be worth $1 million? Maybe. Will it change the world forever?
Definitely.
I think we're definitely. Yeah,
cool.
So, thanks,
All
Ian.
right.
Been a blast.
Thank you. Yeah, it was great chatting. We'll talk soon.
Yeah, sounds good.
Bye. Thanks for watching. If you stuck around this long, please let me know in the comments what you thought about this interview. I would love to chat with you about it. And if you look at the show description, you can follow my link to downloadmybudget.com, where you can get the exact budget that I use every month for free. This budget has evolved over a decade of use, and it literally is the same one that I use to pay off over $170,000 in student debt. So go download my budget. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.